More people will be joining us in the next 5 or 10 minutes. We have a terrific program for tonight, very relevant, given what's going on in the world with Trump and Putin, the phone call. What can we expect to happen next? So tonight, this is what's happening. We'll have a few news updates. Then we will go to our first conversation between Medea Benjamin, you know her, co-founder of CODEPINK, co-author with Nicholas J.S. Davies, our other featured guest in that conversation, of War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Shout out to all of you who invited Medea and Nicholas to visit your city and talk about the book, host a book event. We will then have a Q&A with you. You can post questions in the chat. And our next guest will be Peter Kuznick, who is a professor of history and director of the Institute for Nuclear Studies at American University. So he'll be coming on the second half of our program. Co-hosting tonight, myself, Marcy Winograd, also Medea Benjamin. She's going to be playing guest and co-host, as well as Hania Jodat Barnes. We ask that you please show respect for everybody, for the participants, our featured guests, as well as those who are with us tonight. And always, you can agree or disagree, but disagree agreeably, please. Okay, with that, let's go to Medea for a news update.
So I'm going to update you on a couple of things that are related to Gaza and to Congress. One, unfortunately, those 2,000-pound bombs that had been put on hold have now not only been released, but have arrived to Israel. We also saw the issue about the joint resolution of disapproval. You might remember that Bernie Sanders had introduced one about the last tranche of weapons to Israel, and it was quite successful in getting 20 Democrats in the Senate to agree to that. We're trying to get another one of those, but it's become very, very difficult to find a senator willing to introduce them. It seems that they feel that with the ceasefire, there is less of a reason to stop sending these weapons to Israel, and that the senators who want to see a halt put on the new round of $7 billion worth of weapons think that they might get fewer senators this time than the last time, so they are reluctant. In any case, we are pushing. And one of the reasons also, somebody should mute, also one of the reasons I think that there is a reluctance in the Senate is that some of the senators who did vote to put a hold on that last tranche of weapons include people like John Ossoff from Georgia, who is up for re-election in another 2 years. And it's been reported that he's gotten a lot of backlash from some of the Jewish groups in Georgia. So that's just a reminder that we should just keep thanking those senators who voted the last time to stop the weapons, and we should be pushing them again to not send any more of our tax dollars. There was some good news in that the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, despite the law in Israel to ban it from functioning, we heard today a report from the ground in both West Bank and Gaza that UNRWA still is functioning, that it can't collaborate through Israel. It does it through the World Health Organization, which is one of the organizations that Donald Trump took us out of at the UN. There's also letters both on the House and the Senate side that should be coming out this week to support UNRWA. And while we won't get enough of the members to have this pass, given that the Republicans are in control of both houses and that there are still members of the Democratic Party that won't support this, it's still important to show that there is support among the public and to get as many members as we can to sign on to these letters as soon as they come out. So we'll let you know about that. On the positive side, there was a parliamentary vote in Belgium today, the first one in Europe, that called for comprehensive sanctions against Israel, not only sanctions of not selling weapons, but also sanctions against Israeli companies that have any dealings with the military. And so that is a good model that our friends in other European countries are trying to get past. And then finally, tomorrow is going to be an exciting day with a group called Doctors Against Genocide that's going to have their lobbying day in Congress, and we look forward to supporting them on their asks. One of the things that they are very concerned about is that we've heard that, one, the number of people being evacuated for medical treatment is not what was agreed to in the ceasefire, so pushing for more of these patients to be released. But we have also heard that many of these patients are being asked when they leave through Egypt to sign a declaration saying that they will not return to Gaza. So that is, of course, horrific, and especially since they are only allowed out with a maximum of 3 family members. And as you know, they've got large families, and many of them were horrified to see that they had to sign this paper before leaving. So those are some of the things that we'll be working on tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea. Wow, that's like a Sophie's choice, having to choose your family members to escape the possibility of continued genocide in Gaza. And we know that there's now widespread persecution by the Israeli military on the West Bank and attacks on UNRWA schools. You know, you mentioned, Medea, the senators who voted with Bernie for his joint resolution of disapproval. I think he had 4, but some of those who voted with him on at least one might be possibilities for introducing another. So I just want to read the names of those really quickly in case some of these senators represent you. Tim Kaine, you mentioned. John Ossoff, yes. Mazie Hirono, Elizabeth Warren, Dick Durbin, Raphael Warnock, Brian Schatz, Jeff Merkley, Tina Smith, Peter Welch, Chris Van Hollen, Jean Shaheen, Ben Ray Lujan, Chris Murphy, Ed Markey, George Helmy, all voted with Bernie for at least one of those joint resolutions of disapproval to block weapons to Israel. So let's see if we can ask them, urge them to introduce one of their own. Okay, with that, let's go to Hania Jodad Barnes. She has a news update for us.
Certainly I do, Marcy, and it's always a delight to be in community with all of you who are on this call and our wonderful guest speaker. When we talk about political corruption, we cannot ignore the dangerous influence of billionaires like Elon Musk. I don't believe we will have the time on this call per se to really go over all of the awful things Musk has done leading up to Trump's presidency, but it's really important to note that his growing control over critical infrastructures, from satellite communications to artificial intelligence, possesses serious risk, not just to our economy, but to whatever remains of our democracy. Now, in a disturbing new development, Musk is pushing for access to Social Security data under the pretext of verifying workers, raising major concerns about privacy, surveillance, and corporate overreach. His attempts to access confidential government data have already led to resignation of a high-ranking official, sparking outrage among private advocates. Beyond this, Musk's recent actions across multiple sectors have raised alarm and concern. For example, as the head of so-called Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, Musk has implemented mass layoffs in critical federal agencies, including air safety and nuclear monitoring, citing unproven claims of fraud and inefficiency. And we have yet to see the proof that there has been fraud, right? This reckless purge has disrupted essential functions and instilled fear among civil servants. Meanwhile, demonstrations led by wonderful organizations like 50501, which stands for 50 protests, 50 states, and one movement, are erupting across the country. In San Francisco, for example, activists gathered outside of Tesla's offices to protest Musk's exploitative labor practices, while in New York, thousands of marchers came together and marched on President's Day, demanding accountability, chanting, "Elon Musk has got to go Eric Adams too. This moment is very critical for us as Musk positions himself as the untouchable force, shaping everything from artificial intelligence to government contracts. We have to continue to push back and organize and support organizations that are mass mobilizing on the ground. And that needs to happen with any billionaire or trillionaire, that top 1% that influence our politics and the way our policies are shaped in this country. Back to you, Marcy.
All right, so thank you so much, Hania. Yeah, I'm in Santa Barbara on Chumash land, about 50 miles or so from Vandenberg Space Force Base, where Elon Musk launches his Starlink satellites from kerosene-fueled rockets. And there's a lot of controversy over here. Of course, he wants to multiply those rocket launches. And every time a rocket launches, it triggers a sonic boom up and down the central coast of California. People are like, what's that? Was that a bomb? Was that an earthquake? People are upset and they're challenging this, but who knows? He's really got his foot in the door, so to speak. And now I'm reading, okay, he's going to move into the Department of Defense with his Doge guys, and they're looking at cutting probationary employees. I'm not sure how many there are, but overall, there are about 950,000 civilian employees in the Department of Defense, with a budget of upwards of $840 billion, probably more than that. So I know at Code Pink, we've been calling for cuts to the military budget. I never try to call it the defense budget. It's a military budget, the war budget. We've been calling for that for a long time. So let's see what happens. In the meantime, we are now going to go to our two featured guests. You just heard one of them, who was a co-host, Medea Benjamin. She is the co-author with Nicholas J.S. Davies, our other guest in this conversation, of the book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Medea has written 11 books or more. She travels the world to Cuba, repeatedly to bring humanitarian aid to that country that's been under an embargo for decades. She is also on Capitol Hill every day, leading activists, advocates, walking into offices, asking senators, House members to support legislation, oppose other pieces of legislation. So we are so grateful to Medea for that.
Yay.
And grateful to Nicholas, who is also the author of a book called Blood on Our Hands. We've got it, yes, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So tonight, we're going to have Medea and Nicholas on screen. We'll ask, I will ask a few questions, Hania will ask a few questions, and then we encourage you to post questions in the chat as well. And please do stay with us until the end of this program, because we will be calling Capitol Hill and urging our House and Senate members to support peace negotiations to end this horrific war in Ukraine. All right, with that, let's bring up, oh, here we are, Medea and Nicholas. So the first question I will ask Nicholas, and then I'd like to hear what Medea has to say about that. And that is, bring us up to date. This was a big day, right? In terms of peace negotiations to bring an end to this war in Ukraine. What's going on in Saudi Arabia? There are a lot of charges. Well, Zelensky wasn't invited. This is wrong. We can't support this. Tell us what you think. What's happening?
Yeah, so I think hopefully all of us on this call understand that the war in Ukraine has its roots in US policy and the somewhat deliberate breakdown in US relations with Russia over the last 15, 20 years. I think it's important to understand this meeting in Saudi Arabia was not a meeting to negotiate peace in Ukraine. It was actually a sort of foundational step towards that. And based on what the US side said when they came out, they agreed on a three-step process here. The first of which is to restore full, normal, as they said, normal diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia, which would involve fully reopening their respective embassies with full staff and full and normal diplomatic relations in both capitals. Then comes the negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. And in those negotiations, of course, Ukraine will be involved, and so will the Europeans. And then once there is peace in Ukraine, then very interestingly, there is a third stage here, which, to quote what they said to work together on other geopolitical matters of common interest, which frankly, I mean, you know, this is just an admission that this US policies of militarism and imperialism and these wars are huge obstacles to dealing with things like climate change, the things the problems facing the world that we can only solve with genuine cooperation between countries, especially big, powerful countries like the US and Russia and China. On the other hand, now I think we should understand, okay, this was a meeting and a negotiation between Trump's two Florida men, Rubio and Waltz, and his golf buddy, Witkoff, sitting across the table from two career Russian diplomats who have collectively between the two of them about 100 years of experience of diplomacy. So Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, when he came out of the meeting, he was already negotiating. And so what he brought out from the meeting was that essentially this whole idea of having peacekeeping troops from NATO countries in Ukraine after a peace agreement has been signed and peace has been established, that is an absolute non-starter for Russia. He basically just said that we will not accept. So, and of course that sets out Russia's position very clearly. And of course, this is why, you know, this is going to be a difficult and possibly long negotiation. Because on the other hand, we have both the US and the Europeans. One thing they seem to agree about is that somebody should be sending troops to Ukraine after the peace agreement. And, you know, Britain has said they would do that. The US has said it would not and expects the Europeans to do it. And the Europeans had a meeting yesterday in Paris and couldn't agree on very much. But I think what we really, in the big picture, what we need to look at and really to feel good about is that Russians and Americans were actually sitting down today across a table for the first time in over 3 years. And this compares with the previous administration, who would not talk to the Russians at all, and whose only plan for this war in Ukraine was to keep it going, heading really full tilt towards either you know, the complete destruction of Ukraine by Russia, or greater involvement by the US and NATO that would have led to World War III and a nuclear war. And so, you know, I think whatever we all think about Donald Trump and Elon Musk and, you know, Trump's Florida man and Trump's golfing buddy and all the strange cast of characters he's surrounded himself with, you know, this is one thing that Trump is at least trying to do that, you know, that really we should try to understand and try to support in any way we can.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And I'm just going to repeat a little bit of what you said. for those who came in recently. Basically, you said they met in Saudi Arabia. Trump brought his golfing buddies and Witkoff, who was over there in Israel negotiating the ceasefire earlier. They were sitting across the table from some experienced diplomats who had about 100 years of experience between them, including Lavrov, and they discussed opening embassies again and restoring full diplomatic relations, which, my goodness, that's certainly a positive step. They discussed beginning the peace negotiations and engaging Europe in that, and deciding what they could collaborate on in terms of the climate crisis and other issues of mutual importance. So, Medea, what do you make of it all?
Well, I think it's so important what Sandy said about how earth-shattering this is, how revolutionary it is compared to what Biden was doing, which was not only sanctions, it was also trying to isolate Russia. And it was all about selling weapons, weapons, weapons. It is interesting that one of the issues that it seems that the Russians are appealing to Trump about is his transactional nature and wanting something for this. Well, let's see how much of the rare earth minerals that we can get from Ukraine for you to pay back for the weapons that you've already sent, which really is appalling. I mean, let's remember Ukrainians, by the many, many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands have died in this, and to start wanting to extract wealth from their country is really quite grotesque. The other thing that they have said to butter up the Trump people is to show them how much money the U.S. has lost by these sanctions, saying that they were about $300 billion that U.S. companies forfeited through these sanctions. And so this is really going to be sold to the U.S. and the U.S. people as a way to kind of recover some of the lost money, both through taking minerals from Ukraine as well as new trade relations with Russia. And of course, that would mean that they would have to be a lifting of the sanctions on Russia. Now, Europe, some of the adjectives that have been used is to say Europe was gobsmacked. Europe was in a panic. They really don't know what to do. As Sandy said, they held an emergency meeting and they're going to have another one. And at first, before Russia came out and said, sorry, NATO troops is a non-starter, they were passing around these forums about how many troops are you going to send? And, the UK sending, okay, we'll send troops. And I think Sweden even said, we'll send troops. And Poland said no. And Germany said no. So, they're all over the map. For some of us who want to see a transformation in things like NATO, it's actually a good sign that Europe is now finally realizing that they can't just depend on the United States, that this is an emergency for them to figure out how they're going to have their own, what is often called a security architecture that doesn't depend on the United States. Unfortunately, a lot of what they're talking about is that they're going to have to spend more money on their own military. Rather than them coming to terms that this war has been horrific for them as well, especially for the European economies, which have been hit harder than Russia has with the sanctions. So the European officials are in a panic trying to see how to relate. I think there is something to be said about the starting of these talks behind Ukraine's back, but as Nicholas said, it's really to start a relationship between Russia and the U.S. And it does highlight the fact that this war has been a war that has been pushed on the Ukrainians. And we see now that the Ukraine that there is a tremendous divide within Ukraine. We have Zelensky who wants to keep on fighting, but we see through the Gallup polls that the majority of Ukrainians don't, that they are exhausted from this war, that they want to see a quick negotiated solution, and that they are willing to have territorial concessions. So when people say that this is behind Ukraine's back, well, one, as Nicholas said, Ukraine will obviously be part of the next discussions, as will Europe. And there are things that have to be negotiated between the US and Russia. And also just to understand that we hope that this will lead to a more a more cooperation between Russia and the United States, and we're going to have Peter Kuznick coming on to talk about some of the denuclearization issues. But let's hope this is a move in that direction. And the final thing I wanted to say is that we hear rumors now that Trump is saying that he might be willing to withdraw US troops from some of the Baltic states, and that would be Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, as part of negotiations. And this is what, Russia had been asking for when they asked that NATO not be expanding to Russia's borders. So there are some very, very big issues that are on the table now.
Thank you, Medea. Hania.
Thank you, both Nicholas and Medea. I think there's been a few pointers that you brought up that touched on this, but what might a peace deal look like? And how different does it look from the Minsk two-peace accord that included a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front lines, release of prisoners of war, constitutional reform in Ukraine, granting self-government to certain areas of Donbass, and restoring control of the state border to the Ukrainian government?
Well, I think the critical difference between what they're aiming for now and what was achieved with the Minsk Accords is that the Minsk Accords were intended to be temporary. And I mean, the ceasefire was a ceasefire in place, and they moved the heavy weapons out of buffer zones. But then there were political agreements too. The Ukraine was going to give a new autonomous status to Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass in the east of the country. And the leaders of what they then called the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, they agreed to stop fighting based on that. And they gave up their plans to actually fully secede from Ukraine based on what they were promised in the Minsk Accords. But of course Ukraine did not actually ever grant that autonomy to them. Ukraine did not ever work with them to organize elections in those provinces. And so, I mean, the whole thing became a frozen conflict and eventually blew up again. And the whole, what everyone on all sides says this time is that we do not want this to be another frozen conflict. We want to really settle this in a way that all sides can agree with to have a real lasting peace. And was there, I think there was another part to your question?
Was it
does that
the
answer?
borders?
The borders. Yeah, well, yeah, they're going to have to negotiate these things. And I think, but whatever borders are agreed to will really have to be acceptable to both sides. I mean, the whole idea is that both sides agree permanently to whatever the agreement is. And, so many conflicts in this world end up reigniting because one side has won and the other side has lost. And the side that has lost ends up with resentments that end up leading back into conflict again. And in any peace agreement, the idea is to avoid that. So, I mean, we wish them all the best, but as far as exactly which, what territory Ukraine will be willing to give up. And also with these security guarantees, at this point, they are clearly, the Russians and the West are clearly taking completely opposing positions on security guarantees to Ukraine. But I think it's worth understanding the West is talking about these security guarantees in strictly military terms. If they really make peace, and a peace that everyone is satisfied with, then that in itself should be the best security guarantee. And there can be non-military aspects to to ensuring that this peace is a real stable and lasting peace. There's also one of the things that was mentioned last week was that the line of contact would need to be monitored, as in Minsk they had the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, monitoring the ceasefire line, and they did an incredible job of that from 2014 and 2015 at least, and until 2022. And so maybe they could be involved again, but I don't know. This all really has to be negotiated by all the parties involved.
Absolutely, because we know that war is not the answer. It's been about 3 years that this war has dragged on, and as Medea mentioned, hundreds of thousands of soldiers have died, tens of thousands have been wounded, millions displaced. Our treasury has been raided to the tune of about $175 billion, while 60% of the people in this country live paycheck to paycheck. Almost half are food insecure. So I think that it behooves us all to support this effort to resolve this peacefully rather than continue a war that could go on for a long, long time. Yes, Medea.
Yeah, I mean, I want to reiterate that because looking at the very active chat, which is great to see, we see that people on this call have very different opinions about this. But there is a saying that's attributed to Cicero, which is that an unjust peace is better than a just war. And I think that's something we really should keep in mind. There is not going to be a just peace. This is a horrific war. I think we should be condemning Russia for an invasion that has led to such horrible, horrible destruction. And we should be condemning the United States and the UK for pushing this war when it could have been resolved. And we should be recognizing all of the suffering that has happened to the Ukrainians and to the Russian soldiers, many of them conscripts, many of them who never wanted to fight in this war. So let's see that, as Marcy said, I hope we're united in saying we want this war to end. And there will have to be sacrifices, unfortunately, made on all sides and compromises made on all sides. In terms of the United States, we never really have to pay for our mistakes. And that is unfortunate. And I see people in the chat saying, well, why didn't we mention that we mentioned the $200 billion that the U.S. has spent on this. And that is a fact, I think, that we want to keep foremost, that the American people don't want to keep spending this money. We started out with updates from Hanya about Doge, and all of this is about trying to find ways to cut our budget, and certainly cutting the budget and the money that we're sending to Ukraine and to Israel would be a great way to begin. So anyway, this is just to say that I think there is a commonality. Unfortunately, though, we don't find that when we go to Congress. And maybe I could give a little update on what happened today, because we started the day on going to the Democratic members of the Senate, and tomorrow we're going to the members of the House that had over 2 years ago signed a letter that some of you might remember, 30 of them, saying that in addition to all the economic and political support that the Biden administration was giving to Ukraine, maybe it would be good to begin negotiations. And they got in so much trouble with the higher ups of the Democratic Party that they withdrew it within 24 hours, and we haven't heard from them again for almost now it's going to be close to 3 years. So we wrote a letter to the Democrats saying, you came out as the war party in supporting the genocide in Gaza, and now you are looking like the war party where Trump is saying that he is going to end this war, something that got him a lot of votes during the election because it was part of his campaign message. And it's you Democrats that are pushing back, and we're already seeing that pushback, and it's coming in many different forms. It's coming directly from members of Congress who are saying, how could Trump do this? This is a betrayal of Ukraine. He's making these horrible concessions to Russia without even having those concessions be part of the negotiations, that the possibility of entering NATO should still be on the table. And we're hearing it from places like MSNBC, people like Rachel Maddow. We're hearing it from liberals like Tom Hartman, who is just, having a fit about this. And we see behind the scenes the kind of pushback that we know must be happening. Well, it's already happening in the Republican Party as well, where there are Republican hawks who don't want to support Trump on this, but are actually afraid, and so are kind of mild in their condemnation. And we see others who just recently were hawks, who are now saying they support Trump on this, including Marco Rubio himself. So the Republicans really don't know how to act. And let's remember that Republicans and Democrats are both in the pockets of the weapons companies, of the military industrial complex, and they're not happy about this at all, because even more than Israel, they were making tremendous profits from the weapons to Ukraine. So there are a lot of forces that will be coming to bear right now on Trump to not come to a quick negotiated settlement. Some of them coming from Ukraine, some coming from Europe, some coming from NATO, and some coming from the Democrats and his own party. And that's why it's all the more reason for us to have this kind of discussion and the action that we're going to be taking tonight.
Exactly. And just to remind everybody, the action will be at the end of the program to call our members of Congress and say, now is the time to support a peaceful resolution of this conflict. That is really a drain on our treasury. There are material conditions that we're living with in the United States. People are struggling. And beyond that, it's no answer, right? We know that this is a conflict that has been ongoing, certainly for a long, long time. We know the U.S. backed this. Some people call it a coup, the overthrow of a democratically elected president in Ukraine, $5 billion. Victoria Nuland admitted that on the way out the door. That triggered a civil war in eastern Ukraine. 14,000 people, I've read, maybe more, died. So even Wikipedia says the war didn't start in 2022. I'm not defending the Russian invasion. It's horrific, but we do know it was provoked. I myself read the partnership statements that Blinken and Biden signed about 3 or 4 months prior to the Russian invasion, in which they said, Ukraine, you have every right to retake Crimea, which is ethnic Russians, right? They don't want to be part of Ukraine. You have every right to join NATO. We encourage you to, knowing that this was a provocation. And of course, it's like a bait and switch. When Ukraine says, we want entrance into NATO, NATO says, no, you're at war, forget it. So it's really dizzying. I did want to ask you about the peacekeeping force that did maintain the peace for a while after the Minsk peace accords. Maybe, Nicholas, you can give us some more background on this. Exactly who are these people and why can't they be brought back in?
Yeah, well, that's the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And yes, they had it's going back in time a bit now, but they had, I think it was about 700 ceasefire monitors, plus about 700 staff. And these are unarmed peacefire monitors. These are not troops, although some of them were professional soldiers, but in that role, they were unarmed. And and they put out daily and weekly and monthly reports on any ceasefire, any violation of the ceasefire. They investigated each case and try and do justice to both sides and try and keep the two sides talking to each other and not let any ceasefire violations turn into escalation and then restarting the civil war. And I mean, we have throughout this whole period, we have been told so many things that are not true by our own government about the whole situation. The US government has denied having any role in provoking the Russian invasion. And I think this is still an obstacle that we have to overcome as we talk to people about this. And I encourage anyone that has not read Maya and Medea's book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. We go over all that history, the expansion of NATO, all the warnings from the wise heads, the experienced American diplomats who told them, no, this is an era of historic proportions.
Nicholas, I think we're going to have to stop here because we have Peter waiting. And I'll also put a link to our latest article that goes into great detail. But Hanya, I think you're going to introduce Peter.
I believe that's Marcy.
Okay, yes, and we will unmute later after Peter speaks for a while. We ask him some questions and we can thank everybody. All right, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our next guest, Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's also the author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America. He's the co-author with Akira Kimura of Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives. A New York native, Peter received his PhD from Rutgers University in 1984, and he was active in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement. Welcome, Peter Kuznick, to CODEPINK Congress.
Thank you, Marcy. I think you've given me motivation to update my website at the university, because the one you're using was my description from about 25 or 30 years ago. I will update that a tiny bit now to bring it more currency. I've written a number of additional books. The most recent one was co-authored with Oliver Stone and the former Prime Minister of Japan, Hatoyama, and it was called the Untold Post-War History of the United States and Japan. A decade ago, more than a decade ago, Oliver Stone and I did a 12-part documentary film series and a series of books, like the one behind me, called The Untold History of the United States, which was a bestseller, New York Times bestseller for 7 weeks, and a bestseller on 3 continents. The documentary is played all over the world. So I've done a lot of other things that have had, I think, more of an impact. Most recently, I was on the Tucker Carlson show with Oliver. Now, the reason we did that was because I have a former student who's a Trump insider, and I was having lunch with him, and I asked him, what's the best way to influence Donald Trump's foreign policy? And he said, go on the Tucker Carlson show. So Oliver and I did go on the Tucker Carlson show a few weeks ago, and it was a very strange experience. I had dinner with Tucker the night before, and as soon as he and I sat down, he said, Peter, I'm really a leftist when it comes to economic policy and foreign policy. I said, well, no, I didn't really know that. I would not usually be found with Tucker, but he really is sincerely frightened by nuclear war and sincerely anti-war in a lot of ways, and is very critical of the neocons who Trump has in his administration. So I think that was at least a good starting point. And then somehow Trump reposted our 2 hour appearance on the Tucker Carlson show. And he says certain things occasionally that make me think he might have actually watched it and maybe learned a little bit of it. But what I wanted to talk about tonight, um, I just finished a talk before a group out of Baltimore who are the Quaker meeting and their big national following, and talking more about nuclear issues. Medea had asked me to touch on nuclear issues, and but to focus also on what's going on with Ukraine. And as I'm sure Nicholas has been saying, uh, this has been a bizarre week. A week like no other that I can remember in recent American history. And it began last Tuesday with the release of the Mark Fogel, the prisoner American held by the Russians, and by Vinnik, the prisoner held by the Americans, the Russian prisoner. But more interesting to me last Tuesday was what Zelensky said. Zelensky said that if we don't get quick admission into NATO, he said, we're going to have nuclear weapons. He said, will we be given nuclear weapons? Then let them give us nuclear weapons. Give us back nuclear arms. Give us missile systems. How reckless. I mean, this stuff has gotten so out of control, reckless. Zelensky first called for nuclear weapons back in October, at which point Putin warned that if there's any motion toward actually giving uh, nuclear weapons to Ukraine, then Russia is going to respond so aggressively that it's going to be terrifying. So that was Tuesday. Then Wednesday, we've got Pete Hegseth's uh, comments, and Hegseth, who is so hawkish, so frightening. I mean, his body, is full of um, extreme right wing, neo-Nazi type tattoos. Uh, but even Hegseth had the wisdom at this point to say that Ukraine is not going to be joining NATO, and Ukraine is not going to get back the territory that it lost. Well, that created an uproar in Europe, especially in Europe and in Ukraine. And what he also said there was very interesting. He said that and I hope stop me if this is stuff that we've already been discussing, because I don't want to go over what everybody's been talking about.
Well,
But
just to update you, Peter, we've talked, a bit about the Ukraine issue, both Sandy and I. So if you could maybe summarize this part, but get what we really did want you to talk about is what Trump has said about denuclearization and talks, and whether you believe that.
And how that might impact plans for a $1 to $2 trillion nuclear rearmament program.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that, or unhappy to talk about it. But this week, actually, more happy than unhappy. Um, so to just summarize what I was going to say about Ukraine, so that you figure that Hegseth's talk on Wednesday, Trump's phone call with Putin on Thursday, uh, then we've got Vance's talk to the Munich Security Conference on Friday. The meeting today between Lavrov and Rubio and company. I mean, this has just been totally unexpected, and I think a major step in the right direction. I'm very encouraged to see that we're talking rather than threatening each other for the first time in 3 years. So that I'm glad to see. But when I put that in the broader context of what Trump's doing, and I look at his uh, really imposing fascism here in the United States, and the reaching out to the extreme, to the neo-Nazis in Germany, and aligning with the extreme right-wingers in other parts of the world, and Musk's fascist salutes and the other initiatives we're taking. And my fear, and I look at what there was an article in the Washington Post 5 days ago that said that American intelligence officials expect the Israel to attack Iran's nuclear sites within the next 6 months by June, they said. And I look at what Hegseth said also, that the reason why he wants to end the war in Ukraine so we can go after the real enemy, which is China. And I look at all the China hawks surrounding Trump, and I think that we could take a step in the right direction when it comes to Ukraine, and then take steps in the wrong direction when it comes to Iran, Gaza, Israel, and China. But that all said, what else happened on Thursday last week totally blew my mind. And that was when Trump called uh, for reducing U.S. nuclear weapons. And I'm looking for my exact wording here, if I can find where I had it.
Yeah, I think he said he wanted to cut the defense budget or military budget in half, and he wanted.
Yes, he said this was on Thursday. He said we're all spending. He said there's no reason for us to be building brand new nuclear weapons. We already have so many. You could destroy the world 50 times over, 100 times over. And here we are building new nuclear weapons, and they're building nuclear weapons. We're all spending a lot of money that we could be spending on other things that are actually, hopefully, more productive. And he says China's going to catch up to us within 5 or 6 years. He said if these weapons were ever used, that's going to be probably oblivion. And he says, let's cut our military budget in half. We can do that. Think we'll be able to do that. The Chinese response was given by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman uh, Guo Jiakun, who said the United States has been advocating America first, so let's see America be the first to cut its nuclear weapons, which I thought was an appropriate response. The overall, Lavrov, before he met with Trump and before Trump's outreach last Thursday, Lavrov said that when Trump talks about America first, that reminds him of Hitler talking about Deutschland über alles. So the Russians are coming into this with their eyes wide open. And that's partly because of Trump's nuclear policies during his first term in office, when it began with his first phone call with Putin. And Putin said, we should renew the New START treaty, which expires, he said then, in February of 2021. Trump puts down the phone and asks the people in the room, what's the New START treaty? And they tell him, and Trump gets back on the phone and says, oh, no, I don't like it. I don't like it. We're not going to renew it. And Trump was followed through on that. He pulled the U.S. out of the INF treaty, the Intermediary Nuclear Forces Treaty, pulled the U.S. out of the Open Skies Treaty, pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and did not renew the New START treaty. Fortunately, Biden did. But now it's about to expire again in February 20, excuse me, February 2026. And there's no movement toward renewing it until possibly last week with these latest statements by Trump. Also, the Project 2025 called for the U.S. increasing the size of its nuclear arsenal, which most of the nuclear powers are already in the process of doing. During Trump's first time, or one of the meetings, he was told that we had in the world 70,000 nuclear weapons back in 1986, and that had been cut down to 14,000 when this meeting with Trump was going on. Trump's response was we should increase America's nuclear arsenal tenfold. It was at that point that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson called Trump a fucking moron, and which of course was quite accurate. so Trump's policy during his first term would give me no confidence. His new nuclear posture review in 2018 was drafted by Keith Payne. Some of you will remember that in 1980, Keith Payne, uh, in 1980, Keith Payne uh, had written an article saying if there's a nuclear war, the United States will probably lose 20 million people, but that might be worth it in order to wipe out the Soviet Union. He was the one put in charge of drafting Trump's 2018 nuclear posture review, in which Trump lowers the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons and uh, and talks about these new mini nukes that he says, because Trump had always said, what's the point of having nuclear weapons if we can't use them? To most sane people, that means let's get rid of the nuclear weapons. To Trump, during the first term, that meant let's make them more usable. And so he called for smaller size mini nukes, tactical nukes that we could use much more easily. So, so what do we make out of Trump's now advocating, talking rationally about nuclear weapons and cutting them dramatically? I mean, I was recently in Oslo. I was part of the Neo-Nadanko delegation to the Nobel Peace Prize. Neo-Nadanko, as most of you know, is the atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those are my friends. I've been taking students on a study abroad class in Hiroshima and Nagasaki every summer for 25 years until COVID. And so I've been nominating Neo-Nadanko for many years for the Nobel Peace Prize, and they finally won. And they have been pushing for abolition of nuclear weapons for many, many years now. And I saw them. I was back in Japan, in Okinawa and Tokyo 2 weeks ago, and I met with the leaders of Neo-Nadanko again. And they're very, very committed, of course, to doing so, as are many people around the world. But I think that we've got to do what we can to encourage Trump where the few areas in which he's right, and to stop him in the areas in which he's wrong. So I think that what he's trying to do in terms of pushing the peace process with Ukraine, I think we have to take it with a lot of salt, but and we have to do everything we can to push him in the right direction. And the same thing when it comes to these rants, is what he's saying now about nuclear weapons. Even though it's contradictory to a lot of other things that he's doing in this administration and to Project 2025, I think that we have to, and I don't know what would motivate him to do the right thing, except maybe he loves his golf courses and he doesn't want to see his beautiful golf courses and hotels get blown up in a nuclear war. But it's clearly not out of the same motivation that we would have for wanting to abolish nuclear weapons. And the other thing is, I've said that since I'm the one who nominated the current Nobel Prize winners, that if Trump does end the war in Ukraine and Trump does abolish nuclear weapons, that I would nominate him as well. I would have a hard time doing that without throwing up, but maybe it would be worth it from the standpoint of humanity moving forward if we can stop him from imposing outright fascism in the United States and supporting the fascist forces in Europe, which I think is going to be difficult for us to do. But we must mobilize on all fronts at once, given how dangerous a situation we're confronting now. So, Medea, I'm not sure if that's what you want me to talk about, but
yes, we really appreciate your analysis. Peter Kuznick, professor at American University, professor of history, director of the Institute of Nuclear Studies. We would love to have you on for longer, Peter. We are up against our clock here. We've been on for an hour. So I'm just going to really thank you. Medea thanks you. Hania thanks you. Grace Siegelman, who's navigating our tech, thanks you. Everybody on the chat, you can thank them in the chat. We're going to move in right now. Oh, before I forget, I think I know what motivates Trump on this. I think he wants that Nobel Peace Prize, like you mentioned. Obama, he got it. And I think he now says, well, like you said, well, what are we doing with these nuclear weapons? We're never going to use them. So why are we spending another $1 trillion to upgrade them? And it's a difficult, like you said, it's a difficult position to be in, to say, he's right on this, but he's so wrong on that, because then people accuse you of being a supporter of Trump. But we have to say, when somebody's doing the right thing, that they are doing the right thing, and that is to denuclearize. So with that, we're going to move into our take action portion, our Capitol calling party. We have a script that I think Grace will put up in the chat or up on the screen in a minute. But basically, we're going to be calling Congress. Hania, can you demonstrate it for us?
I certainly can. And I know that there's been a ton of conversation happening. Emotions are running high right now. I just want to share something. As a child, as someone who grew up in a war zone in Iran, while deals were being made on the back end, bombs were dropping on schools, children were dying, mothers were losing their sons and daughters. So, as someone who stands against occupation anywhere in the world, I just have to say we have to, as the human body, have to work together despite our differences to make sure that these bombs stop dropping, right? So my heart goes out to Ukrainians. My heart goes out to Russian people who are oftentimes blamed for the wrongdoing of their government, and obviously Gaza and Iran, my Iranian community. So with that said, yes, Marcy. So I see that there's 184 people on this call. I just want to thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for sticking it out. And our speakers were so incredibly amazing. So let's pick up our phones and let's make those calls. Grace, if you can please share the script. I don't know if people can see me still or not, but we're going to take action tonight. We are going to call the Capitol, and the phone number you should see is on the screen, 202-224-3121. We're going to ask for our representative to be connected to their office. In California, unfortunately, our representatives, especially our senators, their voicemail is always full. Sometimes I don't take calls, but we're going to continue on calling. So what you're going to do is you're going to introduce yourself, and you're going to mention your zip code. Let these folks know that you are a member, you are their constituents, and your voice matters. And believe me, they listen to every single one of these calls. So we are going to urge Congress and our politicians to support efforts to negotiate a ceasefire and a peaceful resolution to the Russia-Ukraine war, because the war has to end. And look, I'm sending all of you love. Let's get to it. And if you have any questions, please put it in the chat and we can address them. But happy calling.